The church was packed with people that Sunday morning. Cameras flashed like lightning, gold fabric hung from every corner, shining under the bright lights. The choir hummed softly, their voices floating through the air like angels. At the front, standing before the altar in a white gown that sparkled like stars, was Zainab. Her hands trembled as she held her bouquet of white roses. Pastor Elijah stood beside her in his royal blue robe, smiling widely. His gold watch caught the light as he raised the microphone to his lips. "Today, heaven rejoices," he announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "Today, God's will is being fulfilled before our very eyes." The congregation clapped and shouted, "Amen." But Zainab's eyes were filled with tears. Her makeup began to run down her cheeks. The crowd whispered, thinking they were tears of joy. But they were wrong. Suddenly, Zainab dropped her bouquet. The white roses scattered across the altar floor. She reached for the microphone with shaking hands. "This is not God's will," she whispered. The entire church fell silent. The drums stopped. Pastor Elijah froze, his smile disappearing. The cameras kept flashing. 3 months earlier, life was simple for Zainab. She was 23 years old with a gentle spirit and a voice that could make angels jealous. Every Sunday morning, she led worship at Pastor Elijah's church. Her voice rose above all others, pure and clear like morning water. Zainab lived with her mother, Mama Rahmat, in a small clay house at the edge of town. They had little money, but they had faith. That was enough, or so Zainab believed. Pastor Elijah often praised Zainab in front of the whole congregation. If purity had a sound, he would say, pointing at her, it would be Sister Zainab's voice. The church members would clap and nod in agreement. Zainab would smile shyly and bow her head. One Tuesday evening, after choir practice ended, Pastor Elijah called Zainab to his office. The other choir members had already gone home. The church was quiet except for the sound of crickets outside. "Sister Zainab," he said softly, closing the door behind her. "Sit down. The Spirit spoke to me about your destiny." Zainab sat down slowly, her heart beating fast. His eyes had a strange shine to them as he leaned forward and smiled. "God is preparing your husband." That Sunday, something unusual happened during service. Pastor Elijah stopped the praise and worship suddenly. He raised his hand, and the entire church fell silent. Even the drummer stopped mid-beat. "The Lord has spoken to me," Pastor Elijah announced, his voice echoing through the building. "God has chosen a man for our beloved daughter, Sister Zainab, a man who will lift her from dust to glory. A man who will show this congregation what happens when you trust God's plan." The congregation erupted in applause. Women shouted hallelujah, men whistled and clapped. Mama Rahmat, sitting in the third row, burst into tears of joy. She covered her face with her wrapper, overwhelmed with gratitude. Pastor Elijah gestured toward the back of the church. "Come forward, man of God," he called out. Everyone turned to look. From the back row stood a tall man in an expensive white agbada. His name was Alhaji Suli. He was a wealthy Muslim businessman, well known in the community. Gold rings covered his fingers, his shoes were polished so bright they reflected the ceiling lights. Alhaji Suli walked slowly to the front, smiling confidently. Zainab watched him approach. Her smile began to fade. Her hands gripped the edges of her chair. Something felt wrong. Later that afternoon, Zainab sat in Pastor Elijah's office. Her mother sat beside her, still wiping tears of joy. The pastor sat behind his large desk, fingers pressed together like a tent. "But Pastor," Zainab said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "Alhaji Suli is old enough to be my father. How can this be God's will?" Pastor Elijah's face hardened. His voice dropped low and firm. Obedience brings blessing, my daughter. God's will is not always comfortable. Sometimes it requires sacrifice. Mama Rukhmat reached over and squeezed Zainab's hand. If God spoke to the pastor, who are we to question him? Do you want to disobey God? Zainab looked at her mother's hopeful face. She looked at the pastor's stern eyes. She felt trapped like a bird in a cage. No, Mama, she whispered. I don't want to disobey God. Pastor Elijah smiled again, his warmth returning. Good girl. Trust the process. Your life is about to change forever. As Zainab stood to leave, she caught her reflection in the mirror hanging on the pastor's wall. The girl staring back at her looked scared. Her own eyes looked like those of a trapped animal. That same evening, after everyone had gone home, Pastor Elijah's office door opened again. This time, Alhaji Suli entered alone. He carried a thick leather envelope under his arm. The two men sat across from each other. No prayers were said. No Bible was opened. Alhaji Suli placed the envelope on the desk. It was heavy. Pastor Elijah opened it slowly and smiled at what he saw inside. Stacks of crisp Naira notes filled the envelope.
This will seal the covenant, Pastor Elijah said with a laugh, closing the envelope quickly. Alhaji Sule leaned back in his chair, confident. Once she is mine, there will be more. Much more. I keep my promises, Pastor. They shook hands firmly under a framed Bible verse hanging on the wall. The verse read, Touch not my anointed, and do my prophets no harm. Outside the office, Zainab had returned to pick up her forgotten Bible. She stood near the door, frozen. Through the thin wood, she heard muffled laughter. She heard the words, business of faith, clearly. Her hand shook as she picked up her Bible and walked away slowly. The laughter echoed in her ears all the way home. That night, Zainab couldn't sleep. Rain fell softly on the zinc roof. She wrapped herself in a thin blanket and walked outside, barefoot, into the darkness. Behind their small house was a patch of red earth. A wooden cross stood there, simple and weathered. It marked her father's grave. Deacon Musa had died 2 years ago, suddenly and mysteriously. Zainab knelt in the mud, rain soaking through her nightgown. She touched the cross gently. Papa, she whispered, tears mixing with rain. I wish you were here. I don't know what to do. She remembered his last words before he died. He had grabbed her hand weakly and whispered, Zainab, never let anyone sell your soul in the name of God. Never. At the time, she hadn't understood. Now she did. As she stood to leave, the wind picked up. It whistled through the banana trees. For a moment, Zainab thought she heard her father's voice carried on the wind. They killed me with their greed. She spun around sharply, but no one was there. Only rain and darkness and the wooden cross standing silent in the mud. 2 weeks later, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up outside Zainab's small house. Neighbors came out to stare. Children ran alongside the vehicles, shouting and laughing. Alhaji Sule stepped out slowly, dressed in a flowing white agbada, embroidered with gold thread. His driver opened an umbrella over his head, even though the sun was shining. Rings flashed on every finger. Mama Ramat rushed outside, adjusting her wrapper nervously. Alhaji, you honor us, she said, bowing slightly. Alhaji Sule smiled and entered their small parlor. He sat down heavily on their only good chair. From his pocket, he pulled out a velvet box and opened it. Inside were golden bangles, thick and expensive. For you, he said, placing them on Zainab's wrists. You will live like a queen. Every woman in this town will envy you. He patted her head gently, the way one pats a child or a pet. Zainab felt her stomach turn. When he stood to leave, a piece of paper fell from his pocket. Zainab quickly covered it with her foot. After he left, she picked it up and read it. The note said, "Finalize with Pastor before she refuses." Her blood ran cold. That Thursday, during choir rehearsal, Ruth pulled Zainab aside. Ruth was Zainab's closest friend, sharp-eyed and bold where Zainab was quiet. "I heard something," she whispered urgently, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. Two elders were laughing behind the church. They said, "The prophet has found another miracle marriage. This one will pay well." Zainab's heart sank. "What do you mean?" Ruth grabbed her hands. "Zainab, this isn't about God. This is about money. You need to run." Zainab shook her head, tears forming. "No one will believe us, Ruth. He's the pastor. Everyone trusts him." Ruth reached into her bag and pulled out a small brown envelope. "Then we gather proof," she said firmly. "If anything happens to me, open this. Keep it hidden." Zainab took the envelope with trembling hands. Later that night, she tucked it inside her Bible, under the book of Psalms. She didn't know it yet, but Ruth had just saved her life. That same night, Ruth whispered a prayer before bed. "God, if speaking truth costs me everything, let it be worth it." She had no idea how soon that prayer would be tested. The next morning, alone in her room, Zainab opened the envelope Ruth had given her. Inside was a photocopy of a handwritten ledger. It looked old, the ink smudged in places. At the top of the page it read, "Church blessings and prophecies." Below that were names. Beside each name was a large amount of money and a note. Sister Gloria, 500,000 naira. Prophesied job in Canada. Brother Emeka, 1 million naira. Prophesied healing of mother. Deaconess Joy, 750,000 naira. Prophesied husband abroad. Her hand shook as she scanned down the list. Then she saw it. Her own name. Sister Zainab, 2 million naira. Prophesied marriage to Alhaji Sule. Her breath caught in her throat. 2 million naira. That's what her life was worth. That's what Pastor Elijah had been paid to marry her off. But it was the name at the very bottom of the page that made her drop the paper. Deacon Musa, Zainab's father. Removed. The word removed was circled in red ink. Beside it was a single sentence. Too much questions. Her vision blurred. Her father hadn't died of sickness. He had been silenced. Zainab clutched the ledger to her chest and whispered through her tears, "Papa, I will not let them silence me too." But the walls have ears, and Pastor Elijah was always watching. That night, Zainab woke to the sound of footsteps outside her window. Her heart pounded. She lay still, listening. Suddenly, a stone crashed through the window, shattering glass across her floor. Wrapped around the stone was a piece of paper. Mama Ramat screamed from the other room, "Zainab, what was that?" Zainab's hands shook as she unwrapped the note. Written in crude handwriting were 5 words: "Obey the prophet or join your father." Mama Ramat brushed in, crying and clutching Zainab tightly. "Who would do this? Why would anyone threaten us?" Zainab said nothing. She knew exactly who sent it. The next morning, Pastor Elijah preached with fire in his voice. His sermon title was written on the board behind him. "The rebellious shall perish." He paced the stage, sweat dripping down his face. "When God speaks, obedience is not optional," he shouted. "Those who resist his will invite destruction upon themselves and their households."
Zainab sat in the front row, staring at him. For the first time, she saw him clearly, not as a man of God, but as a wolf in shepherd's clothing. 2 days later, Zainab gathered all her courage. She arrived at the church early, before anyone else. Pastor Elijah was in his office, counting money. She knocked softly. "Pastor, may I speak with you?" He looked up, surprised, but smiling. "Of course, my daughter, come in." Zainab stepped inside and closed the door. She had hidden a small recorder under her scarf, pressed against her chest. "Pastor," she said, her voice trembling but steady, "did you kill my father?" The smile vanished from his face. Silence filled the room like poison. Then he laughed, not a joyful laugh, but a cold, mocking one. "Your father was a fool," he said slowly. "He touched the anointed. He questioned what God was doing through me." "So you killed him?" Pastor Elijah stood and walked closer. "I didn't lay a finger on him, but when you pray against the disobedient, God answers. Do you understand me, Zainab?" She nodded, her heart racing. He leaned closer, his breath hot on her face. "If you disobey me, God will silence you himself, just like he silenced your father." Zainab left the office quietly, but under her scarf, the recorder had captured every word. That evening, Ruth came to Zainab's house, eyes blazing with determination. She said, "I'm going to expose him this Sunday in front of everyone." "Ruth, no," Zainab begged. "It's too dangerous." "If we don't stop him now, how many more will suffer?" Ruth asked. "I'm doing this, with or without you." Zainab hugged her tightly. "Then be careful, please." But Ruth never made it to Sunday. That night, Ruth didn't come home. Her mother called everyone, searching frantically. By morning, the whole community was looking for her. It was a little boy who found her necklace. It was lying near the church well, tangled in the weeds. That Sunday, Pastor Elijah stood before the congregation and smiled sadly. He said, "I have sad news. Sister Ruth has traveled abroad for evangelism work. She left suddenly, called by the Spirit." Zainab's blood turned to ice. She knew the truth. Ruth hadn't traveled anywhere. During worship, Zainab's vision went dark. She collapsed, fainting in front of the whole church. When she woke up, she was lying on a bench outside. And in that moment, she made a decision. Silence would no longer protect her. Only truth could. The weeks passed slowly. Zainab stopped talking. She moved through the house like a ghost, silent and distant. Mama Rahmat misinterpreted her silence for holiness. Her mother said softly, stroking her hair, "You're becoming a true bride of God's will, humble and obedient." But Zainab's silence wasn't submission, it was strategy. She was planning. Every night, she listened to the recording she had made. She copied it onto a flash drive and hid the drive inside her Bible, marking the page with a drop of her own blood. She underlined a verse in red ink. "The truth shall set you free." At night, she prayed, not for blessings or miracles. She prayed for courage. "God," she whispered in the darkness, "if you are real, give me strength to speak when the time comes. Let my voice be louder than their lies." Outside her window, the moon hung low and red. The wedding date was set, 3 weeks away. Zainab smiled faintly in the dark. She had a plan now. And when the day came, the whole church would hear the truth, whether they wanted to or not. Pastor Elijah thought he had won, but he had no idea what was coming. Late at night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, Zainab sat sewing her wedding gown. Her mother had bought the white lace fabric with borrowed money. Every stitch had to be perfect. As Zainab guided the needle through the delicate cloth, her hand slipped. The needle pierced her finger deeply. Blood welled up, bright red against her brown skin. A single drop fell onto the white lace, staining it. Zainab stared at the stain. It spread slowly, like a rose blooming. She didn't wipe it away. Instead, she whispered to herself, "Let truth wear white." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming. The wind began to howl, shaking the windows. Zainab looked toward her window. For a moment, she thought she saw a shadow move past, a figure standing in the darkness, watching her. Her heart pounded. She stood and walked to the window slowly, but when she looked out, there was nothing, only the wind and the trees bending under the weight of the coming rain. She returned to her sewing, but her hands trembled now. Someone was watching her. She could feel it. The countdown had begun. The night before the wedding, the storm finally broke. Rain pounded the roof like 1,000 drums. Lightning split the sky, lighting up Zainab's small room in flashes of white. Zainab knelt on the floor, her Bible open before her. She wasn't reading. She was reaching inside the pages, searching for the flash drive she had hidden. Her fingers touched only paper. It was gone. Panic seized her chest. She flipped through every page frantically. She checked under the bed, inside her drawers, under the mattress. Nothing. Someone had been in her room. Someone had taken it. Her breathing became shallow. Without the recording, she had no proof. Without proof, no one would believe her. The door creaked slowly. Zainab froze. A shadow filled the doorway. Lightning flashed, and she saw him clearly. Pastor Elijah stood there, rain dripping from his coat. His face was calm, but his eyes were cold. "Good evening, my daughter. I came to pray over you before your big day." Zainab's throat tightened. She couldn't speak. He stepped inside and closed the door. Pastor Elijah knelt beside Zainab, placing his hand on her head, as if to bless her, but his voice was not gentle. "Do not resist tomorrow. God despises disobedient women. You understand what happened to your friend Ruth, don't you?" Zainab's blood ran cold. He didn't even try to hide it anymore. As he prayed aloud, thanking God for this blessed union, something slipped from his coat pocket. It fell on the floor with a soft clink. Zainab's eyes widened. It was Ruth's necklace, the silver chain with the tiny cross, the one Ruth never took off. Pastor Elijah didn't notice. He stood, smiled down at Zainab, and said, "Sleep well. Tomorrow you become a woman of destiny." After he left, Zainab sat frozen on the floor, staring at the necklace. Ruth was dead, and Pastor Elijah had killed her. But instead of breaking, something inside Zainab hardened. Her fear turned into fire. She picked up the necklace and clutched it tightly. Then she smiled faintly. "Yes, Pastor," she whispered to the empty room. "Tomorrow I will obey." But her obedience would not be what he expected. The wedding morning arrived with bright, blinding sunlight. The church compound was transformed into a golden palace. White and gold balloons floated everywhere. A red carpet stretched from the gates to the church doors. Cars filled the parking lot. Journalists arrived with cameras. A live band set up their instruments. Banners hung from every wall, reading "Divine Union Approved by Heaven." Pastor Elijah strutted through the crowd in his finest robe, gold threads shimmering. He shook hands with politicians, businessmen, and church leaders. This was his moment of glory. Inside the bridal room, Mama Ramat helped Zainab into her gown. Tears of joy streamed down her mother's face. "Your father would be so proud," Mama Ramat whispered, adjusting Zainab's veil. Zainab said nothing. Under her veil, hidden in the lining of her dress, was a backup flash drive. She had made a copy days ago and sewn it into the fabric. The choir began singing outside, "Holy Spirit, take control." Zainab closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "Mama, she said quietly. "No matter what happens today, know that I love you." Mama Rament smiled, confused. "What do you mean, my daughter?" But Zainab was already walking toward the door. The church doors opened. The congregation rose to their feet. The choir's voices swelled. Cameras flashed like stars. Zainab walked slowly down the aisle, her white gown flowing behind her like a river. Every step echoed in the silent church. At the altar stood Pastor Elijah, smiling proudly. Beside him stood Alhaji Sulay in his finest igbada, gold rings glittering, eyes filled with greed. Zainab reached the halfway point. Then she stopped. The choir faltered. The music stuttered. Everyone stared. Pastor Elijah frowned. "Sister Zainab, come forward," he said through his smile. But Zainab didn't move. Instead, she lifted her veil slowly. Her face was calm. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but her voice was steady. "Before I say I do, I must say the truth." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mama Rament stood up, confused. Alhaji Sulay's smile began to fade. Pastor Elijah's face darkened. "What are you doing?" he hissed. Zainab reached into her dress and pulled out the small flash drive. She said, "I'm setting us all free." She walked to the projector, the one set up to display wedding photos. She plugged in the flash drive. The screen behind the altar flickered to life. The congregation leaned forward, confused. Then a voice filled the church. Pastor Elijah's voice. "Your father was a fool. He touched the anointed. He questioned what God was doing through me." Zainab's recorded voice came next. "So you killed him? I didn't lay a finger on him. But when you pray against the disobedient, God answers." The church erupted. Women screamed, men shouted. Cameras turned from the bride to the pastor. Pastor Elijah's face went pale. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came. On the screen, more recordings played. Conversations between him and Alhaji Sulay. "Once she is mine, there will be more money." Laughter. The sounds of cash being counted. Mama Ramet collapsed into her seat, hands over her mouth. The entire church was now in chaos. People were shouting, crying, trying to process what they were hearing. Alhaji Sulay turned toward the side door, trying to escape. But outside, police sirens wailed. Blue and red lights flashed through the windows. Pastor Elijah lunged toward Zainab with his face twisted with rage. "She forged it. She's lying. She's cursed." But her elders blocked his path. The church elders grabbed Pastor Elijah's arms, holding him back. His robe tore as he struggled. "It's his voice," one deacon shouted, pointing to the speakers. Women in the congregation began to weep. Some had given their life savings for prophecies that never came true. Others had lost family members who questioned the pastor. Alhaji Sulay reached the side door, but it swung open before he could touch it. 2 police officers stood there, blocking his exit. "Alhaji Sulay," one officer said calmly, "you're under arrest for conspiracy and bribery." Alhaji's confident smile crumbled. He stammered, "This is a misunderstanding." "Tell that to the judge," the officer replied, snapping handcuffs onto his wrists. Zainab stood at the altar, trembling but strong. She turned to face Pastor Elijah. "You bought a bride," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But you cannot buy a soul." Pastor Elijah's face twisted with rage. Spit flew from his mouth as he screamed, "You are cursed! You have destroyed the church! God will strike you down!" But his words echoed emptily. No one was listening to him anymore. The spell was broken. The prophet had fallen. The congregation sat in stunned silence. Some wept openly. Others stared at the floor, ashamed that they had believed the lies for so long. Mama Ramet slowly stood and walked toward her daughter. Her face was a mixture of shock, grief, and something else. Pride. "Zainab," she whispered, touching her daughter's face. "You knew all along." "Yes, Mama," Zainab said softly. "And I couldn't let him destroy anyone else." The police began leading Pastor Elijah toward the door. He was still shouting, still cursing, but his voice was weak now, powerless. As they reached the church entrance, the doors burst open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted by the sunlight. The congregation gasped. It was Ruth. She was thin, her face bruised, her clothes torn, but she was alive. She stumbled forward, supported by two women from the community. In her hand, she held a smartphone. "I have more," Ruth said weakly, her voice hoarse. "Videos, photos, everything." She held up the phone. On screen was footage of Pastor Elijah digging near the church well at night, burying something wrapped in cloth. "The ledgers, he buried them behind the church. I recorded everything before he found me." Zainab ran to her friend, embracing her tightly. Both women wept. Ruth's appearance sent the church into another wave of shock. People crowded around her, asking questions, crying, apologizing for not searching harder. "He locked me in the old storage room behind the church," Ruth explained, her voice shaking. "He said I would stay there until I learned to keep my mouth shut, but I escaped last night through a broken window." Pastor Elijah screamed from the doorway, still held by police. "She's lying! She's in league with the devil!" But no one believed him anymore. One of the elders stood and addressed the congregation. "Brothers and sisters, we have been deceived. We have allowed one man's greed to blind us. Today, God has exposed the truth through the very ones we thought were weak." Cameras filmed everything. By evening, the story would be on every news channel. By morning, it would be across the nation. Zainab walked slowly to the altar. She picked up her veil from where it had fallen and laid it on the altar, like an offering. Through the open church doors, she could see the police cars driving away. Pastor Elijah's screams had faded into the distance. Alhaji's convoy, once so impressive, was now just empty vehicles in a parking lot. Mama Ramat came and stood beside her daughter. "What will you do now?" she asked softly. Zainab smiled, a real smile this time. "I'll sing again, Mama, but this time I'll sing because I want to, not because someone told me to." Outside, the rain fell harder. Zainab walked toward the door, barefoot now, her shoes abandoned at the altar. She stepped out into the rain, arms spread wide, face turned toward the sky. The water washed over her, cleansing, renewing. Behind her, Ruth limped out to join her, then Mama Ramet, then other women from the church. They stood together in the rain, laughing and crying at the same time. A voice, warm and gentle, narrated over the scene. "When men speak in God's name for profit, heaven will expose them through the weak they tried to silence." Zainab was not a bride that day. She was a voice, and her voice set a generation free. The camera pulled back slowly, showing the church, the rain, and the women standing together under the weeping sky. Fade to black.